Hi, everyone. Welcome. For those who are new to this channel, who haven't met me before, my name is Susan Berishaj, and I'm the founder of Sia Admissions. Today, we are going to talk about what actually separates the candidates who get into an M7 program, LBS, INSEAD, the more competitive programs, from the candidates with equally strong credentials who may not get in. And contrary to popular belief and what you guys read on Reddit, the gap oftentimes isn't higher GMAT score or more impressive titles. The credentials in these pools are largely comparable across the board. What's different is that the admitted candidates build a different kind of application, one that it's more coherent, where goals align, their positioning connects to what each school is evaluating, and claims that can be defended when you go through the interview process and the interviewer may decide to push back on your claims that you make. That's where we're going today. And before we dive into the presentation, I want to take a moment to invite you to write your questions in the comments. I will be addressing those at the end after the presentation. We're going to have about 25 minutes of discussion, 25 minutes of presentation, and then I will go into Q&A. So write your questions along the way so that I can see what you guys are thinking about, what's unclear, and how I can support you during this live. For those of you who want to go a little bit deeper, the additional instructions are in the description of this video. So requesting a profile evaluation or requesting a consultation, those are there. And if you like this content, please give it a thumbs up. It helps us understand what lands, what doesn't land, and share it with your community who are also considering this process, whether they're applying this year or in the future. So with that, why don't we dive right in. So when we think about the pool of candidates who are applying to M7s and LBS and INSEAD, everyone or most of the people in this pool have done the work. Strong employers, strong scores, really strong results in their role. And that then, when you're competing at this caliber, that then becomes the baseline. And the person who didn't get in usually has the same baseline as the ones who got in. So the question isn't who worked harder, it's whether the application is doing the right job you intended it to do. What committees at these programs are reading for isn't impressiveness alone. It's whether the application makes sense as a whole, whether there's a line you can follow from where this person has begun, where you've been, to where you're saying you're going to go, and whether that line is specific to them or whether it could belong to anyone in a similar position or at this phase in their career. Most candidates submit a profile, a well-organized, well-written summary of a strong career. What the committee needs was really more of an argument as to why you. And these are different things to build, and most candidates don't necessarily realize that they're building the wrong thing at this stage. The reason this is hard to also fix from where you sit as an applicant is not necessarily a writing problem per se, is that you can't edit what you cannot see from your own experiences. And that's really where the real work happens in terms of putting together a strong candidacy as you move to round 1 or round 2, or even next year when you're thinking about submitting your applications. And we're going to dive into more details on that so you can start looking through these pieces, and then obviously we can discuss further if more help is needed. There is a version of prep that feels really thorough. You've worked on multiple drafts, you've conducted real school research, you've spent time on your positioning. Candidates who do all of that can still end up on a wait list at programs they were genuinely qualified for. And it can be really disorienting when that happens. The issue is almost never the essays alone. It has started before the writing began, before the essays themselves. And that is typically in the goals development phase. The goals oftentimes were built to hold up when someone, were not built rather to hold up when someone looks closely at them. They sound reasonable from the perspective of your colleague on the surface. You want to do consulting, you want to go into investment banking. These are plausible enough on the page. But a reader who doesn't know the candidate, meaning you, the admission committee reading your application, is going to read that differently. The story can be there, but what isn't there is your own specific, authentic argument. A clear line from what you actually did to where you say you're going, specific enough that you could follow it through without needing to fill in any gaps as a reader, right, as an admission committee. And that gap, it's really difficult to see because you have your entire story built in your mind. You know the reasons you did whatever you chose to do, right? But the work is asking you to connect those nuances in someone else's mind the way you have them in yours when you have specific limitations of word count and number of questions to answer. You can't answer whatever you want. You have to follow what you're being asked. And that requires a candidate or you a little bit of distance from the materials. And it's really hard, again, to do given your own biased view of your own candidacy. And most candidates at this level assume that their application will be read generously, that the committee will connect the dots, recognize what's implied, give credit for ambition underneath the framing. In most professional contexts, strong people get that benefit. That isn't necessarily written on the page, but this isn't one of those contexts. What's written on the page gets evaluated without adding anything else, right? So if the goal says transition into growth equity, the committee is sitting with specific questions. Why this? Why now? What is your actual history, or what actually in your historical experiences points to this growth equity? If the application doesn't answer that specifically, so if the answer requires inference, the candidacy is asking to be taken at faith, right? You're asking the admission team to say, okay, I think this is what they are trying to say. These programs will not do that, do not do that. And the candidates who find out their goals didn't hold up under those real questions usually find out in the interview invitation phase, not before, right? Which means oftentimes you don't get invited to interview because you weren't able to build the baseline communication of what they're expecting of you. At Sia Admissions, we don't touch any essays. We don't do anything else before we finalize the goals. And the goals have been tested, not because goals are just one piece of the application, because if the goals fall apart under any kind of pressure, everything built on top of that will fall apart as well. And that is the first thing in the diagnostic, the first thing that we actually do. And it's the step oftentimes left for later in the process for most candidates, especially those who are doing it on their own. You leave it to the question when you're asked in the essay, what are your short and long-term goals, right? But you cannot build that without, and the rest of the application without really working on your goals first. High achievers lead with results. Metrics, scale, what moved because of what they did. You are a high achiever for a reason. Results tell you you did a great job, and obviously that's normal. That framing definitely works everywhere else. It's the language the professionals of the professional world, and it gets rewarded at every stage of a strong career, right? You got promotions because of the metrics that you produced. But that kind of framing, it's exactly the wrong thing to lead with in an MBA application. And I know this may sound contrarian to what most people believe, but I want to expand on that a little bit more. Results-focused applications, and I see way too many of those, do not tell me your decision-making. So results without decision-making underneath them are a list of things that happened, whether you were involved in it partially, fully, a quarter of the way, we do not know. What committees at these levels are trying to understand is how the candidates think, what they chose when the answer wasn't obvious, where they pushed back, how they operated when the situation was hard and the right move was not clear-cut. Most candidates don't put that in the application, not because it isn't there, because it is, but because they don't realize it's what's being asked for in the candidate's profile. They optimize for what sounds impressive and end up producing something that reads as obviously very capable in the execution framework, but not the bar of what these schools are looking for in strong candidates. The outcome is what anyone in that role may have produced. The decisions that lead there is what's specific to you. That's what differentiates you as a consultant, for example, with your colleague who is also applying and it's 2 cubicles down from you. The way you have made the decisions. And most people don't know how to find that in their own story. That's really not, I'm not sitting here criticizing individuals because it's really difficult to do from your own perspective, what matters, what doesn't matter, making that selection process. And waitlisted candidates at these programs also usually prepare well. The essays were clean, the research was real, the positioning made sense when you read it or when they read it. And obviously the effort was absolutely there, because you wouldn't be placed on a wait list if you didn't meet the caliber of what the school is interested in. But the reality is that it still wasn't enough, not because of bad luck, but because clean and defensible arguments of who you are and what differentiates you aren't the same thing. Clean makes it read well. Defensible means it holds up when someone actually pushes on it, whether that's in an interview or even before that, when they're sitting there with your profile, assessing who should be invited to interview or not. When the interviewer asks you to go deeper on the goal, when they want to know specifically what you do in the role you described, when the question gets precise and the answer isn't there or isn't fully developed, when they're expecting it to be there, those are some of the components that really are the results of not spending enough time early in the development phase to make sure that you are stress testing your goals. Some applicants survive those questioning, but a lot of them don't. And the ones that don't tend to look similar on the surface to the ones that do, which is part of what makes it so hard to see in advance, given your candidacy. At Sia Admissions, we really don't move forward with an application until your goals can hold up under that kind of pressure. Not to be difficult about it, because there's no point in that, but because there's no point in putting forward any kind of work behind what hasn't been stress tested, because everything will have to be rewritten along the way, right? And it won't survive when it matters, which is the decisions the admission team makes in inviting you to interview and the decisions they make after the invited interview. And I know a lot of you are not going to apply to one school. A lot of you are going to apply to multiple programs. And you know that the schools are different. You're going to be doing research, understand the culture, most of you. And you're going to write toward each of those places. That is absolutely real work, and it absolutely matters. You cannot put together strong applications if you don't do that. But it's not the same thing as what we're talking about. The schools are running genuinely different evaluation framework, not different in the way that requires a different tone or different essay examples in most cases, unless they're different questions. Different in what they're actually weighing when they read the application. What makes a candidacy land at one program that can make the same candidacy feel slightly off at another? Not wrong, not weak, just one not quite built for them specifically. And committees are definitely going to notice that, even when they can't always articulate the reasons why. Most candidates try to adapt one application across the schools as much as possible. Obviously, the logic makes a lot of sense. Same background, same goals, adjust the framing a little bit. But the problem is that adapting an application for a school is different from building one for the school. The candidates who get into multiple programs in the same cycles didn't adapt. They built separately, starting from what each school was actually evaluating. And that's definitely a different starting point than most candidates do. Typically what I see is, I'm going to apply to X number of schools. I want to see what are the same questions, and I'm going to slightly make adjustments along the way. That is a different approach than what we're talking about here. And the decisions, the outcomes typically communicate that when it's not built from this framing we're discussing. Now, the same career history can support completely different arguments depending on which decisions get space, which experience get removed, and what the goals are connecting to. This isn't about spinning the facts. The facts don't change. The argument is going to change. At one program, the international dimension of someone's career needs to read as the reasons they're going there, foundational to where they're headed, and not incidental because they're applying or because they're planning to go there. At another, there has to be a specific point of view behind the goals, not just an industry or a function. At a third, the question is whether the leadership arc makes sense at scale. These are different arguments about the same person. Building one of them doesn't give you everything you need for the others, right? And a lot of the candidates that are going through this process are not making those choices deliberately. They're building something that feels true across the board and apply it broadly, which obviously makes sense because putting together a 5 to 6 application, which is the number you should be putting, the number of applications you should be putting in, it's hard work. It's a lot of work to put together a lot of those applications. And if you're putting applications for US and European schools, that also means that some of them have require a lot more work than others. So when you approach it kind of from this perspective of, I want to try to cover as much as possible within this framing, the committee are going to read that. Not because they're comparing versions between schools, because they don't have access to that, but because a candidacy that isn't built for them reads like one that wasn't. built for them. Something reads slightly generic. The reasons for that school feel like they could apply to other people, like they're not the same, there's no differentiation. And if that argument isn't there, it's definitely going to be seen from the admission team, but you may have a hard time seeing it because, again, you are filling in details that the outsider does not have purview to, doesn't know why you've chosen the program, and you need to spend the time to articulate that effectively. And when candidates get inconsistent results, admitted here, waitlisted there, dinged somewhere else, fit is usually the explanation they land on. School culture, timing, something they can't quite name, GMAT, GRE, those kinds of things. Sometimes that's totally right. More often, there's a cleaner explanation sitting in the application itself, where the candidacy was built for that particular school is the question. Whether the goals connect to what that program is actually weighing, where the arguments were made in the right terms for that particular school. Are they able to offer you what it exactly is that you are looking for? If you can't do that, the outcomes are going to follow. When it wasn't built for that school, it can be felt from the perspective of the reader, right? They can see that someone else, like this can apply to any other school in the sort of top 20 category. They may feel like the goals are not entirely correct or can be slightly off. The reason for that school is a little bit too broad. They don't really see how that's going to really support you. And sometimes something, it's not necessarily that clear, just doesn't really follow. So it's important here to iterate that it's not that the candidate isn't strong, right? If you're competing at these levels with strong academics, strong test scores, impressive career, right? You are a strong candidate. It's that application may have been built for a different school and not the ones you were not necessarily waitlisted, mostly not the ones that you were rejected from. And the waitlisted, you may sound a little bit like other people in the pool as well. The thing about this pattern is that it can be readable before the decisions come out. And a decision before submission, it can change the outcome, right? You don't want to go in the cycle, submitting your application and then finding out later on that these were avoidable mistakes that could have led to a different outcome altogether. So we've covered quite a lot what separates admitted candidates from equally strong candidates who don't get in, what committees at these programs are weighing, and why execution alone doesn't clear the bar, why M7s, LBS, and INSEAD read the same background differently, and why that means positioning has to be built separately for each of the programs and not from one version of your story. But what the session really didn't cover and cannot cover in an online forum that it's made for macro level discussion and not specific to you, is that it's not specific to you and your case. We can't necessarily talk about whether your goals hold up or not. I mean, I can try answering questions here live, but it's not the same as looking at your profile and discussing it further. Whether the through line in your application connects in the way it needs to in order to be competitive for these programs. Whether what you're planning to submit was built for the school you actually want, or whether it's sitting somewhere in between programs and it's not going to fully land to any one of those programs. That requires looking at your actual materials themselves. So a few ways that we can do this is one, a profile evaluation. This is a written feedback from me directly, where I will tell you what's working, what's not working, what needs your attention and can be improved based on the timelines that you are looking at, and how can your positioning read for your target programs. The profile evaluation request is free and can be accessed by clicking in the description of this video and completing the form. If you're going through this route, I ask that you submit your resume, whether it's up to date or not, so that I can get a sense of what your career trajectory has looked like. I will tell you, I can't tell you how often I get these profile evaluations where what they answer initially in the form doesn't necessarily exactly match what their resume shows. So it's really important for me to be able to see candid description of the individual so that I can help be as honest as possible. This way you can actually take real action to strengthen your candidacy. The next way that we can engage with, or you can engage with Sia Admission, is a strategy consultation. This is a conversation to see whether working together makes sense, and what would that look like in the context of, again, when it is that you're applying. Both of these links can be found in the description of this video, and we can start from either one of those points of conversation. So now I'm going to move to Q&A, and I'll look to questions that have come through. All right, so I was not monitoring the comments, so let me just look through these. How will I know my story is standing out? In my mind, I'm thinking it will work, but during counseling, it may not. That is an excellent question. And it's true. We have a built perception of our own, experiences. I think the best way to know if your story is going to stand is request a free profile evaluation. I can be as candid with what you provide in terms of helping you really identify what's going to work, what doesn't work, and recognize that no one's profile is perfect. Everyone's profile can be worked on, but recognizing where the really major components that you need to be really mindful of versus things that are nice to have can be really helpful in this journey. So I'm a retired Indian Army officer with 11 years of service, 4-year corporate executive, and 4 years business owner. Is GMAT compulsory for me for M7? Yes, GMAT is compulsory for M7s. My question is probably going to have a hard time, to be very transparent with you, landing a full-time traditional MBA program. You may be looking at executive MBAs, or maybe with a little bit of stretch, looking at the Sloan Fellows programs that are offered by Stanford, MIT, and LBS. Those are for mid-career professionals. I mean, it looks like you have close to 20 years of experience, so most of these schools are going to move you towards the executive MBA, but recognizing that you are, I'm assuming, international at this point, but I could be wrong. You didn't write it down, but so if you are international, it becomes a little bit more challenging. But if you're local to the schools, the EMBA is probably going to be the thing that they're going to push you towards. Just because most of the programs kind of cap their full-time MBA at about 14 years of work experience. Next question. My age is 38 years old, and other than 1 year, I think, MBA in US, I also have an eye on 1 year MBA from MIT and MSX from Stanford. Help guide me. I don't have enough information to be able to guide you. 38 years old sounds like the right age for the MSX, MIT Sloan Fellow program. It depends, I guess, on the rest of the profile. I would encourage you to request a profile evaluation where you share your resume, and I can give you more context in terms of what that would look like. How should one go about the school selection process? I would say school selection, sorry, just looking on those comments. So one of the things that we do here at Sia, so I can only talk about a proven process that works for our clients. And that is, first and foremost, you have to work with your goals. You have to identify your goals. Do not look at any school until that takes place. Then identify what it is that you need to build, to get to your goals, right? And then from there, you look at schools that offer the things that you need. It's a lot of work, but you are approaching it from the perspective of you getting the experiences that you need to help get you as fast as possible to the goals that you want. That is the entire purpose of an MBA. If you start looking at schools before you do the legwork, internal reflection work, you are essentially being swayed by marketing copy at these programs, which may not be the best way to invest your time and energy and capital to go through this process. So that would be the recommended way that you go about your school selection process. Can you speak to how to mitigate a non-quant background in other aspects of the application, or how to mitigate a lower 3.5 range GPA for an M7 application? 3.5 range is perfectly fine for an M7, so I would not be worried about that component at all. I think the non-quant experience must showcase in the way that you make decisions. So you may not be a quant, but you may be using, and you probably are using, data to make decisions. So you're going to have to articulate a lot more of that aspect of you in your application. Obviously, your GMAT or GRE, depending on which one. And I'm assuming if you're non-quant background, you shouldn't be studying for the GMAT in most cases. GRE is probably a better option because you'll get to the scores that you want that are competitive faster. But you do want to showcase strong quant in whichever test you take to make sure that you have, obviously, you can illustrate that you will be able to handle the quantitative rigor necessary for the program, the direction that you're facing. I would also be very mindful about your goals, because if you're non-quant, yes, you can learn, but you don't want to kind of pivot 180 degrees in the opposite direction, because the process of getting there can be very challenging. Oh, you're so welcome. What do you do when you have too good a job to quit to get an MBA full-time, unless it's not worth in Stanford, Harvard? Real question, whether any other schools warrant quitting a PE job. This is honestly a genuine question, and I get this so often because we do work with private equity candidates and people who are having, are in the career that is booming. I would agree that you shouldn't leave a job just for a job of that kind of caliber just for any program. However, I would be looking at where it is that you want to go, and like if you want to go back into private equity, I would probably add on that list MIT Sloan, because it's a really strong program, but it depends again on where you want to go, right? You can still stay in private equity, but what kind of companies do you want to work for, and what does their roster look like, right? So I would assess a little bit more the market, the areas that you want to move into. And if you're leaving private equity post MBA, then the question is, where is that you're going? And then you can obviously add to that list there. So it really depends on what your goals are. I know I keep coming back to those, but really, like, one should not do an MBA without knowing what they're using it for. This is a huge investment in your time, and you can discover, you can take this time to obviously look for ways that you may not necessarily like what you're doing now, but you want to kind of explore what other options are there. You can do it with an MBA, but don't go totally blind, because you don't really have time to, you don't have 4 years like you do in college to really take 2 years to explore and then kind of figure out your pathway. That doesn't happen here. Recruitment starts immediately, so you do need to have a direction. And you know, it's a huge investment without having done that, you know, so take the time to do it. Is it better to go for GMAT over GRE, since GRE has easier math and I feel like it doesn't really test one's analytical aptitude, so higher GRE score is not as favorable as a high GMAT? So from the context of business school applications, about 40% of applicants who are admitted with a GRE score. So the schools are totally agnostic to which test you take. What is important is that you have a competitive score. So if you're like, oh, I want to take the GMAT because it's harder, but I can't get to a competitive score, that is working against you, right? So don't try to prove anything to anyone. Get the score, get the test that you're going to perform better at. I have worked with applicants who come from STEM and find the GRE really challenging, right? It's not one is easier than the other. Really, it's where you can perform your best, because at the end of the day, that's what's evaluated. Now, obviously, you also want to look at what your goals are, because some consulting firms, some investment banking firms will ask for your test score, especially for your GMAT if you were accepted with that score. And admission teams will absolutely assess your candidacy based on your test score if you are applying to those jobs. Because they will say that if you submitted with this score and the score is below the average of that particular area that you are focusing on, they will say no to you, which means you will be unhappy after investing so much time and money in this process. So it's really important to understand the full landscape of things before you invest time and energy on either one of those tests. All right, let me just fix my window because it's, I can't see all the comments. 1 second. Two-year MBA, sorry. Not sure why my window is not moving. Okay, maybe someone can just write a period and hit enter for me, please. That would be really helpful. My computer has decided to act up a little bit on me here. Thank you. Oh, so someone's commenting on a previous comment. Yeah, 2-year MBA is going to be hard given 19 years of work experience. So I would look at other options. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. Do certificates like MBA Math help compensate for a low GPA? 3.3 out of 4. It helps. I would say first and foremost, before you go and take additional certificates, work on your test. Work on the GMAT or the GRE. Make sure that that's competitive. With a competitive GMAT or GRE, you don't need the certificate with a 3.3 out of 4 GPA. We have helped candidates with 2.5 get into an M7. So obviously their test scores were exceptionally strong. So that's your intention there. And obviously you are above 3, so we don't need to go crazy there either. It's not like, oh, you have to have a perfect score or bust. It's really make sure that holistically you are a competitive candidate. And also it depends on how long have you been out of school. That also helps in terms of the overall profile. Can you talk a little bit about what extend M7 track demonstrated interest in their program? Should we be interacting with them as much as possible? Okay, so What do M7s track in terms of demonstrating their interest? So some schools care about you talking to or interacting with their, representatives. So whether that's students, alumni, admission representatives, attending their events, going on their tours. If they're local to you, you don't need to go crazy about that. So those can be really helpful for a few reasons. One, the way you talk about the school, the way you talk about what value you see from their program will change as a result of those conversations. So it's going to help you be more articulate, and it will help you strengthen your candidacy. However, some schools do expect that you are going to engage with them, and they do keep track of that interaction. So it's going to be by school basis, but the rule of thumb is, yes, you should engage with all of them. And then it's not just, oh, here I am, I'm applying to Booth, Wharton, whatever school. Tell me about your experience. You have to go in with thoughtful questions, right? I mean, I'm going to be very direct. Those representatives don't want their time to be wasted. They don't need to tell you their story. They don't need a platform to tell their story. They want to help. So make sure that when you're taking their time, you're going there fully prepared with really thoughtful questions so that they feel valuable and you feel like you got a lot out of them so that you can articulate your story in your applications. And a decent GMAT score. Sorry, I don't actually, I have to look back. So this is about the 3.3 out of 4 GPA, 695. 695 is good, depending on what demographic you are coming from. If you're an overrepresented, that number is a little bit on the lower end. I will say this because I'm seeing kind of what's happening in the market as the new rounds of applicants are coming through, and the test scores are, the averages are higher. So we may, yes, we have been talking about the focus test score being an average of 675. 695 kind of like a over average, and if you're overrepresented, you kind of want to fall in that category. The numbers are changing. So this may be kind of the average score for an overrepresented candidate, and or even slightly below average. And if you have a GPA of 3.3, then you need to score higher. I hope that makes sense. Any M7 offer test waivers? No. No test waivers for M7s. You can apply to other sort of higher ranked schools, or not higher, lower ranked schools that may offer test waivers, but I will be really careful about asking for a test waiver. I know you don't want to take the test, but when you have the offer, and you can have an offer without a test, you will most likely not get any scholarship. And I think that's only fair in the fact that everyone else had to submit their test score. So try to do the test. I know it's not comfortable. I know you don't want to do it, but if you want to have a chance at scholarship negotiations, you want to think a few steps ahead, not just getting in, but obviously you have to pay for it. You want that experience to be memorable. You want not to be in constant anxiety as you're going through that process. So make sure that you have all the tools that they need to say, one, yes to you, but second, also have an opportunity to negotiate scholarship. All right, guys, we have 15 more minutes. Any other questions that I can help answer? And if you haven't noticed, I do like to be very blunt, so I will not sugarcoat anything for you. It can be good or bad, so it depends on your view. Okay, I think I fixed it. What kind of scholarship can one expect at an M7 or near M7 caliber school for MBAs? It can vary. Scholarship can be from $10,000. M7s don't offer full rides, so I will tell you that. But you can have substantial, sometimes $100,000, sometimes a little bit more than that. And near, so we've had candidates get full rides from Ross, from NYU. So those are options as well. Obviously, you have to have a strong candidacy. You have to be an interesting candidate to be able to get those kind of full rides, that they really want you to be there, that you're adding something extremely valuable to their cohort. But those are options. But I would say M7s are not full ride kind of schools. They can be quite generous depending on the school. Obviously, HSW are less generous in that regard, especially for merit-based scholarship. So those are kind of the ranges that we're looking at. Awesome. We have about 12 minutes. If anyone has any final questions, I'm happy to address them here. Otherwise, you can always, if you're watching this as a replay, you can always come back and leave a comment, and we'll monitor it for the next week and see what comments people have added so that we can address them at that point. And as a reminder, if you want a profile evaluation, request one. The link is in the description. So you can request a profile evaluation or request a consultation, either one, depending on where you are in the process. All right, I'll wait here for another minute, and if no more questions, then we can call it a day. All right, well, it looks like there's no more questions. Thank you guys for wonderful engagement. I really enjoyed myself, and I look forward to seeing, great results in terms of admissions. Okay, well, I'm going to stop there because there's one more question that someone put in here. So if you're not leaning high tech, but rather more private equity, investment banking oriented with M7 or near M7s, which do you pick? I would look at schools that have been historically either high quant schools or schools that have been historically finance oriented, if you want to be in that space. So that would be kind of the way I would go at that. And then obviously look at the employers that you want to work for and what is their caliber of candidates. Like, I used to work at a hedge fund, and like the majority of people were Wharton grads, undergrad, grad school, kind of the gamut. So, you want to look at kind of what that caliber of people look like at the firms that you are looking to work for. And that can help you narrow down the list a little bit further, because obviously it can be a lot of schools and you don't want to apply to all of them, because what's important to remember, and this applies to everyone, no matter where you're applying, whether it's an M7 or not, quality trumps quantity every single time. So you don't want to over index on applying to so many different schools so you increase your chances of getting in, because you will compromise on quality. And the quality is what gets you in and what differentiates you, and you obviously need the time to do that. So make sure that you're balancing the two. But 5 to 6 schools should be the norm in terms of how many schools you apply to, but make sure that that's a well-balanced range of schools. All right, I will leave in the high notes there. Thanks again for watching. You know where to go if you want to continue the conversation, and I will see you next time. Thanks again.